Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us in this session about lived experience, policy concerns for people impacted by the criminal justice system. We'll have two speakers today, Trevor Walraven and Joshua Kane, both from the Oregon Justice Resource Center. Typically, I would be reading a bit about their personal biographies, but since their experiences are precisely part of this presentation, I'm going to let them talk about themselves. So I will pass now the floor to Trevor.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for the opportunity. My name is Trevor Walraven. I am a formerly incarcerated individual. And I'd like to share a little bit. I'll give a brief overview of my background and really focus on the work that I do now and the way in which I do my work. And then turn it over to Josh to do similarly, and really want to make this an opportunity for folks to ask questions as they come up, and certainly create whatever level of dialogue we might be able to. So with that being said, I'm just going to kind of jump right into it. Born and raised in Oregon, I made the horrible decision to rob and kill an innocent man when I was 14 years old. I was arrested, waived to the adult system when I was 15. I had a trial when I was 16 and sentenced to life in prison for a minimum of 30 years before being eligible for parole. I served nearly 18 years in 9 different facilities throughout the state of Oregon on both the youth and adult court level, and both short-term and long-term facilities. The bulk of my time in the juvenile system, I served at McLaren Youth Correctional Facility, which is one of our long-term juvenile prisons, essentially. And the bulk of my adult time, I served at the Oregon State Penitentiary. I was released through a statute called the Second Look, which not a lot of folks benefit from. But I initially released when I was nearly 32 years old. Fortunate to get a job working with a staffing agency, which essentially helped people, not just people who were coming out of incarceration, but certainly that was a big segment of the folks that we worked with, to find employment. And also work with employers to potentially utilize our services. So I did that for about a year and a half, and then I started working with criminal defense attorneys throughout the state of Oregon. I also very quickly started speaking publicly, mostly at colleges and universities, but also with elected officials, with folks who are and were stakeholders in the community, district attorneys' offices, victim services divisions, restorative justice practitioners. Pretty early on, I started getting involved in that kind of stuff, also going back into facilities to share my experiences, not only through the process of incarceration, but also the process of transitioning back into custody after having been incarcerated for a good portion of my life. So in 2017, I started working with the legal community. I have a couple of colleagues, one who was also a formerly incarcerated young person, and another individual that had been doing advocacy work for a good number of years. And we started working together collaboratively, not only to help criminal defense attorneys throughout the state of Oregon defend their clients, but also in advocacy-oriented reforms, getting involved with our elected officials, having those conversations and being transparent about our backgrounds, and helping that hopefully inform their decision-making process. And have continued to look to do that work and expand that work. My title, my 2 titles, primary titles, are Prison Outreach and Policy Associate. So I have a newsletter, 2 different newsletters that I oversee, one specific to youth who are system involved, and one specific to the organization more holistically and the variety of work that it does, which is the Oregon Justice Resource Center. Transitional services, helping people come out of incarceration and get on their feet, and doing so from the lens of having the lived experience of navigating that process myself, and therefore being able to understand in a very different kind of way. In addition to that, trying to continue to help inform our stakeholders and policymakers about what the system looks like, and how to best move forward with reforms, how to ensure that we're including the voices that are impacted by the decision that our elected officials make, growing the voice of those with lived experiences in our colleges and classrooms throughout the state, so that we have students who are our future leaders, our future lawyers, judges, elected officials in a variety of capacities, and neighbors ultimately, with a hopefully a different perspective than they would otherwise glean, having gone through an educational process without learning from those who have actually been impacted by the systems that they're learning about. And of paramount importance, I think, is the engagement of these individuals to have these conversations in a wide array of perspectives, so that we are not just talking about individuals that have similar backgrounds to myself, going into the system young, serving lengthy period of time, but we're also hearing from people who went in at 30 and 40 and 50 years old, for 1 year, for 10 years, for 50 years, so that we're getting a wide array of perspectives, and we're better informed about how we move forward with our policies. So that's kind of on the advocacy front. On the working with criminal defense attorneys throughout the state, done a lot of work at the primary form of interaction is through what we call document management services, and I have a juvenile division and adult division. Josh will talk a little bit about this, providing those resources to attorneys, and doing so again with a lot of my staff as individuals who have a background of lived experience, and so they're doing the review of documentation, the organizing of these things with an understanding that most people in the profession never have. And it's a good thing that they don't have it, in the sense that we're coming from a background of lived experience, and certainly the more people who don't have lived experience, the better. But I really think there's a great degree of importance that we elevate those voices and we include them in our decision-making process. I also do a lot of support work for those who are in the system pre-trial level, and helping them understand how to navigate the system that they're going to be navigating, potentially, depending on the outcome of their criminal proceeding. So when we talk about juvenile delinquency, we're talking about engaging in these individuals' lives at an early stage, and also consistently, and with that lens always in our back pocket, so that we're relating in a very different way than most professionals who maybe only have the academic side. And not to discredit that in any way, shape, or form, because I think it's extremely important. But I also think it's extremely important to couple it with the experience of someone that has been there, and navigated that, and ideally successfully. It's also in working with our elected officials, when we're talking about mass incarceration, how do we, relieve the degree of individuals who are incarcerated, the numbers, how do we bring down our population, how do we support people while they're inside, again, from a lens of having lived experience, so we know what kind of programs we're supporting, and we're trying to encourage these things like higher education, because we know that those have very real and tangible impacts on recidivism rates. We know that they help people transition in very different ways that lead to more successful outcomes. And so being that voice, same thing with criminal justice system and reforms, going into those conversations, being willing to have those difficult dialogues with individuals that are oftentimes not expecting an individual with a background such as mine, or any number of other individuals, Josh's, to have a conversation in the way we do. And also the use of parole and probation, and recognizing just the importance of having these conversations, supporting other individuals who are transitioning through that process, not only them personally, but being willing to have conversations with the supervisors in those offices, oftentimes as someone that's on supervision, you go through different supervisors over time. Making an effort to go back and talk to those parole and probation officers that you had in the past, creating relationships with them so that you have that open dialogue and you're able to go and say, hey, you know, I heard you got so-and-so on your caseload. I was there when he was released. How's he doing? Being able to open that dialogue and creating that community that I think is really important. So those are a few pieces of the puzzle that I wanted to outline. I'm going to turn it over to Josh at this point, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Trevor. And thank you everyone for being a part of this. So Trevor is my half brother and also was my co-defendant. And so our story is very similar. However, I was 18 when the crime occurred. And so I never traveled through the juvenile system or had to deal with any of that. I was convicted of felony murder in 1998 and sentenced to a mandatory minimum sentence for 25 years, and spent that time in four different prisons in Oregon, as well as county jail. And one of the things that I think stands out in relation to this conversation for me is that I was very fortunate in being able to take advantage of some college programs while I was incarcerated, and ultimately got my bachelor's degree through the University of Oregon prior to being released. And that exposed me to a lot of classes that had to do with sociology and criminology. And it opened my eyes personally to the fact that there was a lot of studies done. There's a lot of material written out there that is really, kind of was surprising to me how much of it was based on theory and not much in the way of like the voices of people that have lived experience and have, used that experience to inform the information that's being produced, inform policymakers and so on. So that was eye-opening and also somewhat inspirational in my desire to be a part of being part of that voice. So I ended up ultimately serving about 22 years, just under 22 years, and was released via the governor's clemency in June of 2020. And Trevor had already been working in the position that he holds with OJRC, doing the data management work. And so he was able to be an advocate for me to be employed with him. And I've been doing that job since my release. I'm currently managing a team of people who are all processing juvenile discovery from juvenile cases in Oregon. And the majority of what that is, and Trevor kind of alluded to it a little bit, but by and large, the majority of it is getting large amounts of scanned documents that need to be broken down into an organizational structure and indexed in order to make them more easily accessible to the attorneys, to the defense attorneys and the team. So that's the majority of what we do. There's also video and audio evidence that we have to process, making sure that it's converted into a format that's accessible to people, and cell phones and other things like that need to be processed. So that's the majority of what we do for what I do for work, and it's very rewarding to come from a place where originally having been incarcerated and being able to do something in the way of giving back by providing that service to people who are, similarly situated, waiting trial, similar to how I was back when I was 18. And I believe that had there been somebody who was able to help provide those services back when I was going through that, I think that that would have improved my defense team's ability to do their job. Not that the end result would have been different, but I think that it would have certainly been very helpful to my defense team. So for me, I feel like that's a rewarding thing to be able to do, a rewarding form of employment. And it also exposes me through the Oregon Justice Resource Center to other opportunities to be able to contribute, to be able to have a voice. One of the things, and we may talk a little bit more about some of this stuff as we go along, but one of the things I was able to do was actually use my lived experience to offer my opinion to a legislative committee that was considering putting together a bill for allowing people who are currently incarcerated in the state of Oregon the right to vote. And that was another way in which I felt like it was, I appreciated the opportunity to be able to share my lived experience, to come from a place where from a place where there doesn't immediately jump to one's mind that there's a lot of value in sharing about the experience, but to find ways in which we can, and to offer that up in a way that's rewarding and valuable. I've also presented for multiple different college classes, many of them with Trevor. We'll do presentations for college classes pretty regularly. And I think that kind of covers the brief overview of my OJRC stuff. I did want to mention, I also currently hold 2 other positions that I've been able to use my own perspective and background in order to inform those positions. One of them is through the University of Oregon. I'm a contractor that provides, that works curating video materials off of the U of O's website and putting them together in 2-hour sections that are then provided to all of the institutions in Oregon to be played with the intent of being played 1 2-hour section each week for a 10-week series. And we've been able to produce a number of seasons worth of that material for the U of O's prison education program. So my experience in having been incarcerated and having had some knowledge of what many of the people who I interacted with would have wanted to have as media content that maybe they couldn't get off of the basic television that was provided, helps me to decide what to choose, as well as having continued contact with people that are currently incarcerated or recently released, and conversations with them to get a better understanding and inform my decisions on the content that we're sending in. The third job that I'm currently doing, I actually started, I believe, about 6 months ago. My sister-in-law has a business where she provides coaching, essentially, multiple different kinds of coaching for youth that are transitioning from residential treatment programs and trying to transition back into their home life, which is a struggle for a lot of them, which is actually similar to, I think, the struggle that a lot of people who are incarcerated face when trying to transition back into free society from incarceration. So the service that I'm able to provide is a wellness coaching. So my focus is primarily on helping these youth understand some things about diet, exercise, sleep, and how those things affect their mental health, their decision-making processes. And I'm able to connect with a lot of the youth that I work with, because I share about the experience of my past, about the life that I had lived, and the ways in which, I feel that the things that the information that I'm providing them with would have benefited me when I was their age. So that covers what I'm currently doing. Unless I'm forgetting something, Trevor, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. We've got some questions coming in, so thanks for those, and please keep them coming. I'll start with the first one that came in, and we'll just start going down the list. I wonder what difficulties, if any, you've encountered personally, not in dealing with the justice system, but in bringing your voices to discussions of the criminal justice system. I was fortunate to be welcomed in a variety of capacities, and part of a lot of that has come through a tremendous amount of effort in putting myself out there and being willing to have the hard conversations. I was invited 8 days after my release to speak at the quarterly managers meeting for Oregon Youth Authority, which is our juvenile correction system here in Oregon. And that presentation provided me the opportunity to network with and see individuals who were ultimately line staff when I was doing time there at McLaren, and had now worked their way into upper administration. I was able to meet the assistant director at the time, who's now the director, and start cultivating those relationships very early on. Shortly after that, I was asked to speak at a restorative justice class at the University of Oregon. And I've continued to put myself out there. I've continued to be willing to sit down with district attorneys' offices and law enforcement. And a lot of that, in terms of the difficulties in doing it, is just the amount of time and energy that it requires to garner that audience, if you will. And I've had the good fortune, if you will, to have a deep-seated passion to do this work. And ultimately, I'm now in a position where I am paid to do this work. My salaried position with the Oregon Justice Resource Center helps provide me the living to engage in many ways as I see fit, and put myself out there and have these conversations and do this work. And so I think, again, the biggest piece is being willing to put myself in those oftentimes difficult situations. And for me, I'd probably given hundreds of presentations, or at least 100, before I sat down with a district attorney's office and the victim services division in a county here in Oregon. And I had never, I'd spoken so many times that I hadn't really thought about what that audience might be like. And same thing with law enforcement, right? Over 100 presentations before the first time sitting down with kind of first responder law enforcement, and recognizing that we each audiences ask questions based on their backgrounds. And so, having a DA willing to bring someone like me in to have a conversation with their staff, and subsequent to that, kind of across the board, it's a little different than elected officials, because elected officials are meant to serve their community in ways that I can certainly reach out to my representative or my senator and gain an audience in very different and easier ways than I can someone that is not my elected official, right? Because I am not part of their voting body. But if I can do it with those that are arguably required to interact with me based on structures, then it's that much easier to gain a foothold to then be able to have a conversation with those that know them. And that all developed into, the first person who had invited me to the University of Oregon ultimately worked for the juvenile division in the county in which I reside. And so brought me on to a number of different engagements there on that level where I'm talking to staff or interacting. Being able to speak at the quarterly management meeting for Oregon Youth Authority allowed me to then follow up and say, hey, it was great to see you. Thanks for the opportunity. How can I stay engaged? And being a part of the process to how programming shifts with that organization, that agency. And so really being diligent in putting forth the effort to get involved, I would say personally is the biggest hurdles. Then beyond that, there are still times where, because I'm on active supervision, a jail's policies are such that I'm not able to get into there. And so navigating those things, figuring out, well, can I do so virtually, right? Always looking for where you can move that forward, or recognizing that, okay, I'm going to work my way up the chain of command. And so who can I talk to that can maybe have a conversation about this policy that's in place that's restricting me from the access that I'd like to have, so long as there's a willingness to consider that. Josh, anything on that topic? I'll read it again. I wonder what difficulties, if any, you've encountered personally, not in dealing with the justice system, but in bringing your voices to discussions of the criminal justice system.
You know, I think that you hit it on the head as far as, you know, just needing to be diligent in continuing to reach out, continuing to try to find ways around if you're told no. I think that, you know, you mentioned about the jail being, you know, having rules. One of the things that is a restriction, we are generally not allowed to go back into prisons and jails and such, and at least not without there being a substantial amount of time post-release. And that's a pretty standard policy. So I think that that is one way in which there's been, you know, difficulty. There's been opportunities that we may or may not have been able to be a part of, that we weren't able to be a part of because of having the recent release. So yeah, that was the main thing, I think.
Yeah, and kind of on that note, the next question, what are some limitations that you might say exist in terms of people being open to bringing individuals with criminal justice lived experience into work/professional settings? I think outside of those kind of policy pieces, which again are oftentimes able to be navigated, and this is kind of a carve out, but part of what Josh and I navigated while we were incarcerated was policies that prevented us from accessing different kinds of programming, right? And so we learned through growing up in the system that if you really cared about accessing some kind of opportunity, then you had to put in the work and find creative ways to navigate those policies. And sometimes that's a change in the policy. Sometimes there's a loophole somewhere. Sometimes it's just continued engagement on a conversation basis that says, I care about doing this. I think it will help me. Why shouldn't I benefit from it, right? And so I think outside of those policies that may need to be discussed, I think more often than not, when you're talking about limitations to individuals being able to access, it comes down to a perspective, right? And the need to have a perspective shift. One of the most prominent requests that I make of individuals who are in audiences that I have the opportunity to speak to is to go and have conversations with other individuals. I don't ask anyone to try and go change anyone's mind, but just to offer some perspective of the experience that you've gone through hearing me speak. And maybe that's a positive thing and maybe it's a negative thing, but something I say hopefully will be noteworthy enough for you to share it with someone else. And I think that's such a big piece, right? The willingness to figure out what the pathway forward is. And so for me, sometimes that's meant, look, I'm not going to be invited to talk to this particular staff as a whole, but I may be able to gain an opportunity of having a conversation with someone in charge. And through that conversation, they can then carry that message to other people who have a say in that process. And so getting past the stereotypes, having individuals that can be good leaders to help open the doors for others. I co-facilitate a class at the Oregon State University that brings in people with lived experience. And it was through my continued engagement there of my story and my willingness to share and getting to a place where I could then network. Where last term co-facilitated, we had 15 people with lived experience come and speak. And those ranged a huge background of individuals in terms of crimes committed and time served, and all of those kinds of things were certainly elements of, we've developed a relationship, we've done this long enough, it's become norm, and now we've developed enough of a rapport to say, okay, we trust your judgment to bring in other individuals that are going to bring value to the conversation, and we're going to recognize a value of bringing in a variety of perspectives. So, Josh, do you have anything to add to that?
I would just say that, in terms of limitations, I think it really, Trevor mentioned perspectives, and I think that shifting perspectives is really a big part of it. I think that when it comes to people that are formerly incarcerated experiencing limitation, a great deal of that is because of whoever is putting forth that limitation, generally doesn't have any experience or doesn't have anything other than what they whatever kind of perception that they have based on watching TV or what have you, and the judgments that come with that. So I think that really just being the more people that are able to engage in as many different ways as possible and offer that perspective of being formerly incarcerated, the more people are able to see that it's not just like it's, and we all know this, but it's easy to fall into the thinking of these people are like this, right? And kind of that judgment of, that everybody of this particular experience functions in much the same way. And so being able to shift those perspectives opens more opportunities. And one of the things that I really loved about the class that Trevor was talking about is the fact that initially it was Trevor offering his perspective, and that became something that was respected, and his way of conducting himself was respected, and his opinion about, hey, we need to bring 14 other perspectives in here and have them share it, because just because my message resounds with this person over here, it may not in the same way with that person over there. And so having the many different perspectives, number one, is always a good thing. Having as many perspectives as possible is always a good thing, in my opinion. But number two, it also is, there's so much benefit to the individuals who are released being able to see that there is value in a very negative experience overall, essentially. And the I guess empowerment, the recognition of that value gives, helps them to have that sense of self-worth that I think is really important. So
the other thing I want to drive home on this, as Josh was speaking, that came to mind is, everyone, by my understanding, everyone attending this has a variety of privileges and authority, if you will. And one of that perspectives that sometimes needs to shift is the perspective of the individual with the lived experience. And what I mean by that is, institutionally, we're oftentimes in an environment where it seems as though those in positions of power are unapproachable. And I know even for myself, like there was this self-talk that would occur during parts of my life period where, for whatever reason, I put other people above me, and felt like I couldn't gain their audience, right? Or it was inappropriate to seek out that audience. And through a variety of different experiences in my life, I recognized that, our elected officials are people no different than you and I. Our business leaders, they all can help lead us, and because they are no better or worse than us, they've made different decisions in life, but they're accessible in a way that we can self-talk ourselves into a place of believing that they are not accessible. And so I think that's a really important piece in terms of sometimes that perspective that needs to shift is the individual with lived experience to say that encouragement from one of you all to say, hey, you know, how can we, if you're interested in doing this, but you don't think for whatever reason that it's accessible to you, can we put together a smaller group of individuals that are maybe going to be more open than a larger group of individuals? Or what can we do to help elevate that voice? Because that can go a long way in help developing that. And it's also part of the work that I do in terms of coaching individuals, their self-esteems, getting their confidence up to a place where they can recognize that their message has value and meaning, and that it's appropriate to share it, again, within the appropriate settings. So I wanted to kind of go back to that because I thought it was an important piece. What are some of the ways in which we can promote the importance of bringing lived experience perspectives? I feel that is something not often talked about. You hit it on the head. It's not often talked about. It needs to be talked about more. Again, you know, this experience of hearing from other individuals with lived experience, whatever professions you're involved in, wherever there's intersection with people that have backgrounds, and as you become aware of that, just even asking the question and sharing that with other people. I know Josh and I regularly have people who learn about our backgrounds through any course of events and will be like, you know, I had no idea that your past was what it was or is. And that in and of itself can help shift that conversation and get more people in positions of power to consider the voices of those that have experience and in a variety of backgrounds, right? We're kind of focused around criminal justice today, but when we're talking about houselessness and homelessness, when we're talking about having your children taken away through DHS or other areas, when we're talking about those who have been harmed, when we're talking about even learning what careers we want to endeavor, we should be learning from those with lived experience through that process. So I just wanted to highlight those. Josh, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to just reiterate that, you know, having whatever your position is, just like kind of trying to think outside the box in terms of, now that we've had this conversation, like what ways can each of us elevate those voices, right? So if it's offering a class, then is there an opportunity there to invite somebody with experience to come in and give a presentation or be a participant in a class, and share that story? You know, if there's organizations that people are a part of or happen to be on the you know, like the executive body of, does that position provide you with an opportunity to say, to mention this, to bring it up, to create an opportunity to invite somebody in to share their perspectives? So yeah, I mean, we all have, you know, Trevor touched for a moment on how, you know, each of us has some level of authority or power in our lives in different ways, and thinking in terms of what ways do each of us have that, you know, that ability to share a perspective or share an opinion that can open a door for somebody else to be able to share theirs and offer some new viewpoint, some new information, something that's going to add value and perspective to the conversation.
Yeah, so this next question is one I get asked a lot, and I think it's a perfectly appropriate question. I'm not sure if it is a good question, but what is justice to you, and how have your experiences formed or changed your idea of what justice is? Justice for me is taking a holistic look at any situation, and considering the needs of everyone involved, and moving towards meeting those needs. And for me, I think one of the cleanest ways to articulate this, and kind of a real example that I think is almost entirely missing from our quote unquote justice system, is I feel like, and my experience has been, societally, the question of justice may be asked to those who are identified under the legal terminology of victims in a given situation. And typically, in my experience, the individuals respond, oftentimes with some level of prompting around what the law says, right? And so if the law says that it's 5 or 10 years, then a person's more likely to be like, okay, that's what justice is. Justice is that they serve 5 years for what they did, that kind of thing. Rarely have I had the privilege of witnessing the more important question, follow-up question to that, in my opinion, being asked, which is, okay, you're saying 5 years or 10 years, that's what's justice for what happened. If the individual who caused the harm does that 5 or 10 years and comes back to a community and does the same thing to someone else, was justice still served? And I've yet to have this conversation with anyone who responds, well, yeah, because they did their time for what they did to me or to my family. Because there's a deeper, more systemically rooted desire to have people not harm each other in the community, right? Not cause harm, not cause damage to property, whatever that looks like. And while it can be difficult at times to either not just regurgitate the societal norm of, well, we know that 5 years, not thinking past that, there is, in my experience, a deeper desire to see safe communities. And safe communities aren't, well, we'll remove this person for X number of times so that they can't harm the community during that time. It's much, much deeper than that. And so if or when we can start having those deeper conversations about what justice is, and then recognizing from that it doesn't matter if it's 5 or 10 years or if it's 2 years, what we're really looking for is that an individual get to a place where they can come back to the community and be a productive member of the community. And that bar level is really that they just don't cause harm to anyone else, right? That's the bar we're looking for. The level of engagement, the level of giving back, the level of volunteerism, all of those things are not so important, if you will, as is that they can come back and find success, be a community member that doesn't cause those kinds of harms that led to their situation in the first place. And so I think all of my experience throughout my life have led me to this conclusion. And I know Josh will often talk about needs in a little bit different way that has been very informative for me. So I want to have him kind of speak to this question as well.
Thank you. So I very much appreciate the question. My belief is that I, first of all, 100% agree with Trevor, that my personal definition of justice is going to be very much centered on there not being future harm from the individual who caused the original harm. I think there's a lot of different ways that goal can be achieved. And I think my opinion is that the most likely way to achieve that is through treating people as individuals, as all people are, and dealing with each sort of criminal situation individually. I think that the way that I like to share it, that Trevor was touching on, is that I feel my belief is that all crime comes from a place of need, and that whether that need is financial, whether that need is for anger management treatment or some other form of mental health treatment, whether that need is for education about a different way to do something. I believe that there's needs that drive all crime. And I think that we don't do a great job. My experience has been that we, as the criminal justice system, does not do a great job in identifying and working to meet those needs in a way that is socially acceptable. And I think that there's a great deal more focus on the, as Trevor mentioned, the amount of time somebody does, as opposed to how they spend that time. And I would very much love to live in a world where prison was not a necessary thing. I feel as though there's plenty of people who are incarcerated, and that is the safest thing for the community in that moment. I believe that the majority of people that are incarcerated could spend a heck of a lot less time inside, especially if resources were devoted to identifying what their needs are and working to provide classes, mental health therapy, training, job opportunities, trainings and job opportunities, whatever it is, that's going to give that person the tools to be able to meet that original need in a successful and acceptable way. And my belief is that we are as a country devoting such a large amount of resources to housing people in carceral facilities, and that if we were less focused on the amount of time that somebody has to spend inside and more focused on, let's fix the person, let's give them what they need to be successful, we could be housing them for a great deal less time, which would provide a whole bunch more money to devote towards offering those programs and therapies and trainings and such, as well as helping to identify those common needs before somebody commits the crime, and work towards providing those trainings and those therapies and such to the populations in freedom before there's ever a victim involved. So that's my belief, and thank you.
And I think just to take that one step further and to really build out the holistic approach that I think Josh and I both deeply believe in, is that when folks have been harmed, right, it's not the system's responsibility doesn't end with putting someone in prison. My belief is that if we have empowered judges and district attorneys to represent quote unquote justice, then part of that responsibility is an individualized approach to those who have been harmed to help them find healing in whatever ways that are going to benefit them. And that's where that needs-based piece is really fully encompassed in this conversation. Because for some, it's one-on-one therapy. For some, it's going to be group therapy with other people that have similar experiences. For others, they're going to need just a period of time to process that information on their own. And then maybe it's a restorative justice type practice or some other venue. And in my experience, we're not even asking those questions. We're not even offering any level of support. And I think that is a travesty in terms of providing true justice, because if we can't help people heal, then it's going to be that much harder for an individual to see someone come back into the community, to see others, to see value in others who have caused harm, right? It just creates this process where if we can help an individual process through their traumas and the harms that they've had caused on them, we're much more likely to be a better community. When we talk about justice, I think it's really important to recognize individualized approach for everyone involved and a collective desire to really bring about healing. And for some, that healing is getting to a place where they're not going down that road because they're making different choices. And for some, it's healing so that they can better navigate their daily life. And that it really does look different for everyone. And so we have to be responsive on that very individualized way. Have you encountered any opposition or resistance from people trying to keep you from being included in these spaces? Outside of, like county jails that I'm still trying to navigate access to, Josh talked a little bit earlier about prisons who, want a certain amount of time out of custody before allowing you back in. If you have organizational ties that are maybe adversarial to the agency, you can sometimes need to navigate those kinds of things. And I've dealt with all of those in a variety of capacities. But I think that's also part of where it's really important for you to recognize that the continued effort is worthwhile and continue to work towards what that looks like. I'll give an example. I have on a case, and the client is currently in a county jail. And I was visiting that client at a juvenile detention facility for over a year prior to the client being old enough to be moved into the county jail. As soon as they were moved into the county jail, I reached out to the jail to find about visiting professionally as part of this individual's defense team. And they said, look, you're on supervision. We're not going to let you in. And I worked my way up the chain to where I was talking to someone who was more in charge than just kind of the first, person interacting with. And I kind of gave him some background. And he said, look, our policy is X, Y, and Z. Commend you on doing what you've done and kind of working your way into the position you are, but we can't really do anything about it. So last week I had the opportunity to be in the same room with the sheriff at an event. And the sheriff ultimately has ultimate authority over that jail. And so I pulled him up and said, look, this is a little bit of my background. I'd love to sit down and have a conversation about this. And that has yet to happen. This was just last week. And maybe I don't gain the result that I'm looking for, but that kind of persistence and tactful persistence is really important to continue to erode these barriers that have been put in place to get to a place where you can find that success, or hopefully help shift so that someone else maybe that has a similar experience, maybe it's not severe as your experience, can gain access and then have that positive impact. Josh, anything to add to that?
Just briefly, I was just going to also mention that this is I think we mentioned a little bit earlier, talking about trying to think outside of the box, trying to keep your mind open to, what are the appropriate ways to go about changing or finding a different way to accomplish a goal. And so I was thinking about, there was, during COVID, what we're doing right now became very prominent, where many presentations and meetings and such became virtual and online. And that is a way in which doors have opened to be able to have people from the inside participate in presentations and classes and things like that, and also to have people who would otherwise not be allowed inside a facility be able to participate as well. And I think Trevor and I have both been a part of both those situations, and thinking in terms of, okay, if my ability to navigate into this particular situation is restricted, then what ways is it possible that it could not be restricted, and how can I apply them to this?
Next question is, what are some of the policy impacts that you both personally like to see based on your own experiences? So this is some of the work that I do now. As Prison Outreach and Policy Associate, I do a lot of engagements with elected officials, and I have a lot of meetings and conversations around policy. So, one of those policy efforts that we'll be making during the long session this coming year is the restoration of voting rights for people who are incarcerated. There are several other states who have been working on this as well, and it's one of the things that we're going to be working on to help allow people who are incarcerated and convicted of a felony and in custody be allowed to vote no differently than anyone else in the state of Oregon. We do have mail-in voting, and it is election time right now. And so, that's one of the things that I think is really important. I think part of the reasoning for that is I think it's important that our folks in custody maintain some level of tie to the community. Voting is empowering, and maybe you don't get your way through that process. But it's an important piece of the puzzle to being connected to the community, and being connected to a community is part of what helps it make it easier to be empathetic towards those around you, and thereby often lead to making better choices, right? So where can we build these different pieces? Another piece, our science has come a long way, and we've recognized that young people are not adults, and depending on where you live, mostly shouldn't be prosecuted as adults. That science extends into the late adolescent category. Individuals above the age of 18 and above the age of 21, into those categories. And I think we need to recognize that in a different way. Again, getting more in tune with individualized approaches to folks who have caused harm and had harm caused against them. I really think that as a policy, we need to move towards recognizing that our prisons and our jails really should be solely used for the protection of society. We shouldn't be, if we have corrections facilities, quote unquote, then it shouldn't be a punitive environment. And we need to shift our resource allocation accordingly. So those are a few. Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I think that really we've touched on a lot of things that we would love to see policy change and shift on. I think that the voting is a big one, for all the reasons that Trevor just mentioned. I think that the sentencing people as individuals is a big one. I think that the providing of resources that are going to meet the needs we've talked about is a big one, not just for the prisoners, but for the victims and for the community and for the extended victims, the families that are affected by a criminal act, both the families of the perpetrator as well as the victim, the person receiving the on the receiving end of the crime. And the community as a whole. So I think that seeing policies shift away from the punitive and retributive, and the more towards the restoration and the overall improvement of everybody who is impacted by the situation.
Next question, and the last one in the Q&A, but there's another one in the webinar chat. Do you have any views on restorative justice programs? Have you had any experience with them? Had some minimal experience with restorative justice oriented programming, not personally in terms of those I have harmed. Actually went through a mediation training that was very restorative foundationally. And even trained to be in surrogate mediation and restorative justice oriented engagements. Been involved in symposiums, given presentations on restorative justice. Because I am largely a believer in individualized approaches, I think restorative justice is fantastic and a great tool for those open to benefiting from it. And I also think that it's not for everyone, because I don't think anything is for everyone, right? And so I think so many people would benefit from being exposed to even the idea of restorative justice. And, part of what Josh and I have talked about is this healing process, this idea of meeting someone's needs. Those are rooted in RJ, right? And so very much, it's just how do you get there? And sometimes the way you get there is from a one-on-one therapy session for X number of months or years or whatever it takes. And sometimes it's that group engagement. Sometimes it's a surrogate engagement because someone's not willing to face a direct person who harmed them or their loved ones, right? And so how do you get to that place? And then what does that look like for each individual? And so I've been, again, exposed to RJ in a variety of capacities. I'm very much a believer in it. And I, don't have those that I've harmed that have been willing to allow me a personal experience in the ways that I very much would welcome, but also don't want to force on anyone, if that makes sense. And I think that's the other really important thing, is a part of the work that we've done in this state around RJ and interactions with victim services is the recognition of that optional piece with RJ that's really important, because we've had, and I've seen some areas where there's purported restorative justice programs that are ultimately mandated, and that's not restorative justice. And so I think being really, really thoughtful and strategic about how we engage that. And then again, like exposure, right? If you don't know something exists, if you don't understand the framework or something, how can you ever benefit from it? So I'm a huge believer in growing society's understanding of what RJ is. Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo all of that. I have minimal experience personally with restorative justice. I know enough about it. I've read the books, and I've done been in classes about it, and enough to know that I believe in it. And I, as Trevor said, a lot of my belief in what would be an improvement to current policies and practices is centered in that knowledge. And so I do think that there's a lot of ways in which it can improve the entirety of how we address the criminal justice.
So in the webinar chat, there's I think this is maybe some of a comment, but I think I have something I'd speak to regarding it. I guess part of it is changing the focus from victim and rather provide agency to people with lived experience, as in not just victims of the system, but people with agencies whose experience is valuable to shape how we manage said system. Yes, and I think having the quote unquote victim or harmed party voice is also really important. I've been in courtrooms when quote unquote victims, as legally defined by the case, have spoke openly about how supported they felt in the process of the person who had caused harm to their loved ones or themselves. And I've seen others where the exact opposite was spoken to, and individuals spoke to how unsupported they felt and how unjust the system was. And there's varying reasons for that, right? And so I think we need everyone's voice, and I think we need a level of connectedness that we don't have. And part of what I mean by that is oftentimes our prosecutors don't understand the prison system. Our judges don't understand the prison system. And so they're involved in this foundational level of justice, if you will, without real understanding of the system that justice is ultimately supposed to be resulting in. And so 5 years, 10 years, life without the possibility of parole, it's arbitrary and at times, because there's no proximity, and therefore there's no knowledge, and there's no up-to-date understanding of what these systems, how they operate. And I think we would really benefit, and that's some of the work that I've been involved in as well, is bringing our stakeholders into communities that are incarcerated and having meaningful conversations and dialogues similar to what we're doing here today, But having those individuals go into a prison system to meet with the young people who have been in there for decades and the older people who have been in there for years, and figuring out what that proximity looks like in a meaningful way. Josh, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, I value the, inclusion, and my belief is that, it's an opinion that is contrary to your own is a good thing to have in a conversation, and that there should be as many different perspectives shared in order to inform, for all of us to inform ourselves, for society to inform itself. And so I feel strongly that, just like what Trevor said, it's not just a matter of bringing the perspective of somebody with in the situation we're talking about today, from a formerly incarcerated perspective into other other conversations. It's also bringing the other sides, the other perspectives, bringing the people who have suffered as a victim, their voice into the conversation, bringing the prosecutor's voice into the conversation, bringing the judge's voice, bringing the corrections officer's voice into the conversations, because it's all relative and it's all relevant and it's important. And if we don't include somebody's voice, then we're operating from a place of judgment based on some preconceived notions in some kind of way. And so I think that there's just a great deal of value in having that exposure. And both Trevor and I have encouraged youth in classes to be considered becoming a prosecutor. Like, it would be much better to have somebody who has an informed perspective in these positions than somebody who doesn't. So.
Yep, we need good people in all positions: law enforcement, defense attorneys, prosecutors, victim services, RJ practitioners. I mean, we need good and passionate people in every one of these positions, in as great a number as possible, in my opinion. So the last piece here, which works with timing, since we're about 2 minutes left, if my timing is correct. Suggestion from those with lived experience for additional pre-release opportunities, preparation for those still inside but on their way out the gate. I think, again, connecting with someone who's got some semblance of a similar mindset, that has navigated that within the relatively recent past. Things change as time goes on, so I think it's important to keep relevant information. I've been able to stay connected to this work because I've done the work post-release. But I also, got my driver's license for the first time as an almost 32-year-old man back in 2016, right? So I'm going to connect someone coming out of incarceration with someone who more recently had the experience of driver's license. I can point you in the direction of resources, and I can certainly talk to you about things to expect that you maybe not be foreseeing. A big one for me that I often relay is the difference in time, because when you grow up in a system that is a 5-minute walk from itself, that's very different than commuting to work and all the time that things take out here. And it seems like a simple thing, but the more you can understand the things that you are going to be navigating, the easier it is for those things to be navigated. So I just think, connectivity to people, and then as many kinds of opportunities. I know there's some facilities that allow an individual to, for example, go use a credit card before they're actually released from incarceration, or go, through some kind of process that allows them to acclimate in a more meaningful way. And I think that's really important. Josh?
Yep, I agree with all that, and just want to respect everybody's time and thank our host, as well as everybody who was a participant and an attendee. So thank you very much.
Yeah, same here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Trevor and Josh. This was a very interesting presentation. I think personally, for us as an organization, organizing these types of conversations and meetings and dialogues and publishing as well, it's something for us to always keep in mind. when I first received your email that you were interested in participating, and Trevor said, well, yeah, I mean, people with lived experiences are not usually included in these spaces, and we think they should. And I very much agree with it, because precisely for the reason of bringing in perspectives from people that have been actually affected by the system. When you're a scholar studying criminology or a student studying criminology, sometimes it can be hard to know what is actually going on in prisons, in the systems, unless you've actually lived through it. So this was a very valuable presentation. Thank you both. And thank you to our audience. We've reached the end of the conference today. I remind everybody that the videos of all the sessions, except for a couple, will be available in a couple of weeks, and we'll email everybody once the videos are posted. We encourage people to use those videos, share them. They're free to use. So thank you, everyone, and have a good weekend.